Hi everyone. This lecture is going to have two learning goals. The first is going to be to understand the difference between conceptual definitions and operational definitions. And the second will be to understand the difference between categorical and continuous measurement. Let's start by defining what we mean by the term concept explication. So the idea here is that we're going to be moving from an abstract idea, which we'll call a concept, to something that is more concrete, observable, and measurable, which we'll call a variable. The basic idea is how we move from these broad ideas and concepts that we might pose in a hypothesis to things that we're actually going to observe or measure and turn into numbers in the context of a study. So let's look at how this works. We'll begin with the conceptual level, and we'll start with just a few definitions that are going to be thrown around a lot as we look at different measures throughout the semester. So starting at this abstract level, we'll look at some terms, and then we'll apply this to an actual concrete example. So a concept is going to be a term, idea, or theme that is being studied. Our conceptual definition is going to be an abstract description of a concept, which clarifies the boundary of what that concept does and does not entail. So what do we actually mean when we say something like social media? What do we actually mean when we say something like attention problems? What are the boundaries around that concept that we've introduced? When we talk about dimensions, these are going to be subsets or smaller parts of a concept. So if we think we have a really big concept, something like social media use, a dimension is going to be these smaller subsets that we think make up or comprise that larger concept. And the important thing here is that conceptual definitions may vary and very likely will vary across studies. So not all researchers are going to be using the same conceptual definition within their studies. So when we look at studies of something like social media, the way one researcher has defined and looked at and investigated social media might differ from how another researcher at a different university is looking at that same concept. And so the reason it's important to be aware of how researchers are defining these concepts, how they're proposing these conceptual definitions, is because they may not all be working from the same definition. So if we want to draw comparisons across studies, we should want to be certain that they're talking about the same thing across studies. So let's look at an example. Let's take this hypothesis that using social media use might increase attention problems. So our independent variable here being social media use, and our dependent variable here being attention problems. If we depicted this in a path diagram, it might look like this, with social media use on the left, with an arrow pointing to the right at attention problems, the positive symbol indicating the direction of the relationship between these variables. Social media use increasing attention problems. A researcher who is planning to conduct a study to test this hypothesis might pose a conceptual definition like this. Social media use is the act of engaging with digital platforms that enable the creation, sharing, and circulation of user-generated content. This is a pretty nice, maybe pretty robust conceptual definition that we have here. But you might look at this definition and say, well, hey, it's missing some pieces, or it's missing some clarity, or missing some precision in precisely what it might be trying to capture. You might say it's missing some precision in what you mean by use. Are you talking about just overall quantity, such as how many total minutes per day do you spend engaging with these platforms? Do you care about the number of days over the course of a week in which I engage with these platforms, or the number of days over the course of a month or a year? We can imagine different kinds of ways that we might quantify these different numbers. We can also imagine different kinds of platforms or different qualities of platforms that enable these kinds of actions or activities in different ways. So the way they manifest on TikTok might be different than the way they manifest on Instagram, might be different than the way they manifest on something like YouTube. But they all might kind of have these features of enabling the creation, sharing, and circulation of user-generated content. So you might wonder precisely what kind of social media is this definition meant to capture? And you might also say that, well, hey, the act of engaging with these platforms could mean a lot of different things. It could mean that you're just kind of scrolling and passively consuming content that exists. And it could mean that you're actually engaging with and posting your own content by posting maybe videos, maybe comments, and so forth. And we can imagine different time frames on which these different activities might unfold. You know, you might say, are you wondering how often I've engaged with social media yesterday? Or just on a typical day, an average day, or over the course of the last month? So all of these pieces are different, what we would call dimensions of this conceptual definition. We kind of have this broad definition of social media use, but we might want to also pose more precise definitions for each of these dimensions that it might entail. The quantity of social media use, the qualities of social media use, the activities that I might be engaging with on social media, and the time frame on which I might be engaging in those activities. And all of these things, all of these different definitions would help to make this definition a bit more precise, a bit more concrete. So kind of moving from this more abstract level down a bit. And a similar thing can happen here with attention problems. So I might pose the conceptual definition of attention problems as referring to persistent difficulties with allocating, sustaining, and regulating cognitive focus. And you might say, well, exactly what kind or what type of attention are you referring to? Is it just kind of my total capacity for focusing on a particular task? Is it my ability or kind of how good or bad I am at actually doing that? Is it my ability to control task switching from kind of moving my attention from one thing to another? And again, we might think about different time frames. Are you talking about in this moment, am I having difficulty with attention? Is it my difficulty with attention that I experienced yesterday, on a typical day, an average day, over the course of a month, over the course of the year? Again, these are different dimensions, ways that we might continue to add more precision to the conceptual definitions we're offering, in kind of identifying the important different pieces that we might be interested in investigating. And as we kind of continue this process, we're going to be moving into what we call the operational level. Again, I'll pose some definitions here, and then we'll look at some examples of how these manifest in a kind of hypothetical research scenario. So when we're moving from that concrete level to what we call the operational level, we're starting to get more interested in what we would call a variable, which is a selected quality or characteristic of individuals that has a single value for a given individual, but differs across many different individuals. And so this is a bit of a gobbledygook, maybe somewhat overly confusing definition to say things like our independent variable, our dependent variable. Each individual person in our study is going to get a score on that independent variable, on that dependent variable. And we'll look at how this manifests in an actual study in a second. In order to actually assess those variables, we're going to need what we call an operational definition. Kind of building on our conceptual definition, this operational definition is going to describe how a concept, and potentially its dimensions, are actually going to be measured or captured or observed in a study. And the different pieces of information that are specified by an operational definition, the things the researchers are going to use to try and observe the presence or absence of that concept, are what we call indicators or items. So this is just the actual things within our study, the actual questions that participants are going to be answering that we're going to use to assess what is your value on this particular variable. So let's look at some examples to try and understand how this works. Continuing with our same example here, our hypothesis that social media use might increase attention problems. A researcher might say, my operational definition in this study for social media use is that we're asking participants to estimate how many minutes they used TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube yesterday. So I'm going to say, how many minutes did you use TikTok? How many minutes did you use Instagram? And how many minutes did you use YouTube yesterday? So each of these three questions, minutes on TikTok, minutes on Instagram, minutes on YouTube, are what we call an indicator, or the items that we're using to represent social media use. And you can see here, the operational definition is a bit more precise than the conceptual definition we posed on the previous slides. Because here we're looking at a particular time frame, yesterday, how many minutes, so kind of defining time frame in that way. We have three particular platforms, TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. And we're just asking how often, how long did you spend using those platforms? We're not, in this case, maybe interested in what were they doing on those platforms. Were they posting, scrolling, commenting? We just want to know, were you on them? Were you exposed? Give me an estimate of how long you were doing that. So our operational definition is how are we actually going to measure this social media use in our study? And our indicators are those specific questions those participants are going to answer that are going to turn into numbers for us to analyze. And we might do something similar for attention problems. We might say, in this study, we measured attention problems by asking participants to rate their agreement on a scale of 1 to 5, strongly disagree to strongly agree, with 4 items about whether they had difficulty concentrating yesterday. And the 4 items might look like this. Yesterday, I had trouble focusing. Yesterday, I couldn't stay on task. Yesterday, I was easily distracted. And I procrastinated a lot yesterday. And the participant is going to read each of these items, and they're going to rate their agreement with how much that describes their day yesterday, from strongly disagree to strongly agree. Again, each of these 4 questions is going to be the indicators or items that we're using to capture this concept of attention problems. And again, in this case, we have moved from this kind of higher conceptual level to this more precise operational level to say, hey, we're focusing just on yesterday, and we're focusing on these particular kind of manifestations of attention problems: focusing, staying on task, distractibility, and procrastination. Now, why does this matter? I want to just kind of preview what this will look like when we've actually conducted a study, maybe sent out a survey with these questions and had participants respond to these questions for our study. The important thing being that by transforming these abstract concepts into operational definitions that we can actually measure to assess these variables, in this case our independent variable of social media use and our dependent variable of attention problems, is that we're actually going to turn these things into observable numbers that we can then statistically analyze. I don't want you to worry about the statistical analysis part just yet, but I want you to understand what this looks like in the data file that we're going to start creating when we conduct these studies. And so here, what it'll look like is basically an Excel sheet, a spreadsheet, with each participant in our study. And here we typically assign them ID numbers, identification numbers, rather than using their names. We'll talk about kind of issues with privacy and anonymity later in the course. But here we're just going to assign them a number. So participant 1 through 10, we're going to imagine 10 people filled out our survey or participated in our study. We've had 3 items measuring social media use. How many minutes did you spend on TikTok yesterday, on Instagram yesterday, on YouTube yesterday? And then rate your agreement with these 4 items about attention problems. The first question, the second question, third question, fourth question, scale of 1 to 5. And each participant is going to report their score for each of these values. So this participant might say, I was not on TikTok at all yesterday. I spent maybe about 50 minutes on Instagram. I spent maybe about 15 minutes on YouTube. And overall disagreeing with at least somewhat or strongly with all of our attention items here. So they got a score of 1, a 2, a 1, a 2. And this is going to happen for each participant in our study. Essentially, they're each going to be providing these estimates, and we're going to get this nice big data file that has scores for all these values, which we can then start running and applying statistical analyses on. So again, don't worry about the statistical analyses part just yet. I just want you to understand that as we move from these abstract concepts into these observable, measurable, operational definitions, we can actually start providing scores for each individual on each of these variables in our study. And we're then going to be able to kind of compare individuals and look for relationships between these variables in our study. Now, an important kind of limitation of this process of explicating our concepts, of moving from these broad abstract definitions to these precise concrete definitions, is that by narrowing our focus, we're going to be neglecting other dimensions of our concept. By deciding we're going to measure the concept in this way, we are inherently not measuring it in other possible ways that we might want to address that concept. So for example, if I only focus on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube, you might say, well, hey, there are other social media platforms out there in different time frames on which people might be using them that we would want to measure. Same thing for attention problems. When I have inherently used this 1 to 5 scale to try and measure attention, you might say, well, there are other ways we could potentially be measuring attention as well, and you've neglected those definitions. Relatedly, different researchers might be, again, using different operational definitions across studies, maybe even different conceptual definitions across studies. Importantly, too, they might use the same conceptual definition, but then use a different operational definition to capture that concept that they've proposed. So understanding and being able to look at these studies to say, hey, is each researcher actually defining this concept in the same way, is a really important skill for being able to evaluate, hey, are these studies actually looking at the same thing, or are they studying different things? And relatedly, we can only learn about those things that we have decided to measure. So if I am conceptualizing both social media use and attention problems on what happened yesterday, I'm only going to learn about yesterday for the participants in my study. I'm not going to learn about any other day in their lives. And so by deciding to focus just on yesterday, potentially to make these questions easier to answer or more possible to answer, I'm going to miss out on maybe other times in that person's life where these variables might have shown a different relationship or manifested in different ways. So just important to understand that by this process of explicating our concepts, of making them more precise, of coming up with these items that we're actually going to be used to measure in our studies, we're going to inherently limit what we're learning about. And that's just part of the research process. Now, a related thing that you want to understand is this idea of levels of measurement. The assigned textbook chapter provides what I would argue is a needlessly kind of complicated understanding of levels of measurement. They go into 4 different levels, things called like ratio, interval, nominal, ordinal. But when it comes down to actually analyzing the results of a study, those distinctions between those 4 categories is really not super helpful. For our purposes, I'm going to give you just 2 categories, and these are the only 2 characteristics of measurement that I really need you to understand in order to run the analyses that we're going to be running later in the semester. So the first level of measurement is what we call a continuous level of measurement. This allows specific and precise numerical values to be recorded. In other words, assigning numbers to participants in this case is going to be meaningful. We're going to be able to actually interpret what those numbers mean in a meaningful, kind of practical, real-world way. So for example, when we think of something like social media use, if I actually ask people to estimate how often did you use these platforms yesterday, I might see that they're ranging in values from like 0 minutes to 1,440 minutes. That might be a whole day. I'm forgetting off the top of my head. I think so. That's probably 24 hours. So you could sort of range from 0 minutes to an entire day of social media use, which hopefully nobody is doing that. But theoretically, they could. And so in this case, we know what these numbers mean. They have a practical, meaningful value interpretation that I know what 5 minutes means. I know what 15 minutes means. Similar with attention problems, it may just be this 1 to 5 scale, but we know how participants were intended to interpret what these numbers meant. That 1, 2 is disagree, 4, 5 is agree, somewhat or strongly on both ends. 3 is sort of this neutral point, maybe being uncertain. So in this case, we have these continuous measures. They kind of range from one value to another, and these numbers have a practical, meaningful, interpretable meaning. This is opposed to categorical variables, which is any variable that uses categories as values. And in this case, assigning numbers is kind of arbitrary. We're still going to be able to, based on our study, understand what those numbers mean. But it could be different across studies, basically the numbers people are assigning to these things. They're in a way arbitrary based on what the researcher decides in that particular moment. So for example, we might have variables like, what university are you attending? Are you attending Ohio State? Are you attending Michigan State? Are you attending Penn State? In order to run analyses on a categorical variable, I'm going to have to assign numbers to it just so the statistical program can understand what I'm doing, which we'll get more to that later. But it doesn't matter if OSU is 1, MSU is 2, and PSU is 3. There's no kind of meaningful ordering or meaning to these numbers I'm assigning. I could make OSU 3, MSU 2, PSU 1, or whatever order you can sort of imagine. Doesn't matter. These just have to have a number assigned, regardless of what that number is. A more common one that sort of comes up in studies is something like gender. People might self-identify as man, woman, or non-binary, or other, whatever categories are provided on the study. And again, there's no kind of logical ordering. It doesn't matter which numbers are assigned to which values here. They just need to have a number in order for us to statistically analyze those numbers. So again, your textbook is going to provide kind of 2 examples of continuous measures, ratio and interval, and 2 examples of categorical measures, which are nominal and ordinal. But don't worry about those kind of subcategories. I just need you to know some numbers range from meaningful values, potentially like even including values like 0. These numbers are meaningful and assigned in a purposeful way in those cases for continuous variables. And there's categorical variables where These categories that we have are just kind of putting people in these different bins, these different buckets. And there's no kind of logical ordering or meaning to any number we might assign to those different categories. They're just kind of standing in to say, hey, this is category 1, this is category 2, this is category 3, and so forth. And we might have 2 categories, we might have 15 categories. It all just depends on what variable potentially we're trying to measure. So for now, just know continuous, categorical, 2 different kinds of measurement. And that's all you're going to really need to know for our statistical analyses later. And as I mentioned, so the levels of measurement are going to determine the types of statistical tests we can use. An important thing to note here is that it's good generally to measure variables on the highest level that we possibly can. So in a way, measuring variables on a continuous level rather than a categorical level. The reason being is that we can transform continuous variables into categorical variables, but not vice versa. We generally cannot transform categorical variables into a continuous variable. So for example, with my social media measure, I could potentially put people into buckets, non-users versus users, those who didn't use social media use at all yesterday, and those who used social media a little bit yesterday, so 1 or more minutes. So I can get this nice kind of continuous measure of 0 to 1440 minutes, or I can put people into 2 categories. You didn't use it at all, or you did. Because I measured at that continuous level, I'm able to transform into that lower categorical level. But if I only ask people, hey, did you use social media yesterday, yes or no? I'm not going to be able to, after the fact, transform them into a continuous level because I haven't actually collected that information to know amongst those users who used it a little and who used it a lot. So again, it's recommended when you can to always measure variables at the highest possible level with the most possible nuance as you can, because you can always transform and make those variables a lower level, a categorical variable. But again, in some cases, it's not possible. So if I'm just kind of trying to understand which university did you attend, Ohio State, Penn State, Michigan State, there's not really a continuous version of that question that I could come up with. If I'm trying to measure your gender identification, there's not really a continuous version of that measure that I could generate. So when you can, it's good to measure variables at the continuous level because you can always transform them, but it's not always possible to do so. All right, and again, 2 learning goals for this particular lecture: understanding the difference between conceptual definitions and operational definitions. Our conceptual definitions being those higher level abstract definitions, those operational definitions being those lower level concrete definitions that are really guiding what we're collecting in a study, what we're actually measuring in a study. And then this difference between categorical and continuous measurement, this lower level versus higher level of measurement. Again, your textbook making it a bit more complicated. Here I'm trying to simplify it. You just got 2 levels, categorical being kind of arbitrary in the numbers we assign, and continuous being more meaningful, being more purposeful in the values that we're assigning.